Very good morning to those of you who are online viewers as well as on-site worshiping with us this morning. This morning, I am very excited. You know why? Two reasons. Reason number one, in our presence, a surprise visit, my good friend, fellow colleague, fellow pastor, Reverend Dr. Richard Lowe, who has just come back from his sabbatical. That's why you look on his face, you see a glow and a halo around him. All right? And I'm excited to introduce him because, of course, we are fellow. Of course, it's a surprise visit. If I had known he's visiting me, I might change the message. But anyway, the reason I'm excited because he is currently pastoring the church, Eternal Life Baptist Church. And that was the church I grew up in. And I understand that Reverend Dr. Richard Lowe, also must acknowledge his wife. He will be helping your church. So will you join me in welcoming him? Thank you. All right. Second reason I am excited. This morning, the worship team selects music, not in consultation with me, but how accurate. Many of the songs they have chosen talk about the greatness of God. And that is in line with my message. And this is how God works. Wonderful, isn't it? Give the music team a round of applause. A Sunday school teacher was telling his students to draw a picture that is most important to him or her. And so everybody is drawing. And so the teacher looks back and he sees a little boy by the name of Jimmy struggling to draw a picture. Later on, everybody has completed drawing, but except for the boy Jimmy at the end of the hall. And so the teacher goes to him, put his arm around the little boy Jimmy and says, "Jimmy, what are you drawing?" And he replies, "God." So the teacher said, "Jimmy, nobody knows how God looks like." And Jimmy looks at the teacher and replies, "When I am through, they will know how God looks like." We chuckle, but do you know there is some truth in what Jimmy says? All of us have different views concerning who God is. And so this morning, I'm going to put all the views together and categorize them into two categories. Category number one, a high view of God. A high view of God is a view that recognizes who God is. God is that transcendent, that great, that almighty, awesome God, creator of the world. And a high view of God accepts God on his term. And a high view of God will say that, "God, whatever you say, I will do." On the other hand, you have a low view of God. A low view of God is a view that recognizes who we want God to be. As a result, God is like a cosmic concierge. He exists to serve you and me. And so this morning, we want to go to the book of Ecclesiastes and find out what is the view that Kohelet, remember Kohelet in Hebrew, it means the preacher, the teacher says. And so I'm going to invite our sister to read this morning's text from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. No, not this, the text. Before that, or after that, you mean the text is missing? Or we are in serious trouble? The next one? Oh, sorry, okay, yes. All right, correct.
Guide your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen, rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, who do not know what they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool.
Continue.
When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and do not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, fear God.
Amen. Thank you very much. Let's begin by looking at Kohelet's perspective on life and on God. Now, when it comes to life, Kohelet in the book of Ecclesiastes is a man who has a zest for living. All right? And how do we know? Because Kohelet, remember last week we quoted the verse. What did he say? He says, anyone who is among the living has hope. Therefore, a live dog is better than a dead lion. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, even though he says life is meaningless, life is pointless, he still says he does not give you negative recommendations. For example, he didn't say that because life is meaningless, therefore live the way you like in such a riotous living. No. Neither did he say because life is meaningless, is pointless, commit suicide. Neither did he say because the world is vanity, withdraw from the world. No. Instead, he gives us several positive, practical recommendations. I have listed 2 for you, remember? Number 1, whatever your situation is, make the best out of it. Number 2, be willing to take calculated risks. And today, let me add one more, and that is, whatever you do, give your very best to the work. Last month, when you had a combined meeting, I joined in your service, and I'm very glad that your pastor preached an excellent sermon concerning work. And this is what Kohelet says: even though human achievements and human actions are useless, are havel, but you must still give your best. No excuse for you when you come to your work. Laziness, mediocrity, no. Give your very best, because in work there is still value. So, Kohelet is a person, a man, passionate about life. Now, let's come to God. When it comes to God, he is equally passionate. Now, what is surprising in the book of Ecclesiastes is this. Do you know, he is so passionate about God, he mentions the word God 37 times. 37 times. And the word that he mentions in Hebrew, next slide, is Elohim. Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. And this is the Hebrew word for God. Can you imagine? The irony of the book of Ecclesiastes is this. On one hand, he says, life is worthless, life is pointless. But yet, he mentions the word God 37 times. Out of the 37 times, 27 with a definite article. The God, the God, the God. And what is surprising, even the prophetic books in the Bible combined together cannot surpass what Kohelet did. 37 times. That's a lot. And therefore, it tells you that Kohelet is passionate about God. And not only is he passionate about God, in terms of his theological belief, one scholar puts it this way, I like it very much. And this is what he says. Kohelet is a man intoxicated by the sheer godness of God. Wow, very cheap, very profound. Let me repeat. This is what the scholar says. Kohelet is a man so intoxicated by the sheer godness of God. In other words, what he's saying, Kohelet has a very high view of God. He is very passionate about God. And so, he's passionate about life, he's passionate about God. So because of his passion for God, he gives us certain guidelines in the text that we read just now. How, as worshippers, must we, the attitudes that we must have when we come to worship God. So these are the protocols that he prescribes. These are the guidelines that when you and I come to the house of the Lord, or we say, when you come to church for service, what should be your attitude? First, number one, he says, according to the text, proceed with caution or guard your steps. How? Number one, in that text, he says, avoid flippant talks. Right? It's not in the PowerPoint. But good, put the text on. The first thing he says, proceed with caution. And how you do that? Avoid flippant talks. Why? Number one, or how? Number one, listen more than you talk. Isn't it interesting? Listen more than you talk. Why? Because God speaks. You see, when you and I talk a lot, how do you hear the voice of God? Do you know the fundamental difference between the God of Israel, the God that we believe, and the gods of all the ancient is this: we have a speaking God. Idols, God is always compared to the idols. And why? Idols do not speak, but the God that you believe speaks. And how does he speak? He speaks through meditation. He speaks through worship. He speaks through preaching. The question, are you listening? And therefore he says, listen more than talk. And then, of course, he also says, listening is more important than offering of sacrifice. He is not saying you should not offer sacrifice or offering, but he says it is more important that you listen to God. And that is how God speaks. And so that is his first recommendation. Talk less. Listen more, because God speaks. Now, not only that, he also says, let your words be few. Oh, I love this. The 5 most important words that all of us should practice. Let our words be few. Now, let me bring this to, let's apply. We can apply in preaching, all right? And this is something I must tell you, all right? This is off the script. Pastor Richard, Pastor Ayan, and I, we believe, let our words be few. But it's very, very hard. It's easy to preach long messages, but it's very difficult. Anyway, let's come to worship leading. Do you know? These 5 words should be the mantra of every worship leader. Let your words be few. You see, when you are a worship leader, you have an important function. And what is your function? The function is, at the end of it, help create an environment so that people can worship God. And the job of a worship leader is not a commentary leader. I have been to services whereby, thank God, Shalom, you are not guilty of it. I've been to services whereby the worship leader, every verse in the song, comments as if giving a mini sermon. That is not the way, because the job of a worship leader, at the end of it, enable us to worship God. It doesn't matter how many new songs you introduce, but the question is, at the end of your worship, at the end of your worship leading, did we worship God? And if We did. You have done your job correctly. Several years ago, I was a member of a Community of Praise Baptist Church, and Charles Carroll was our pastor. And so he led a mission trip to Rajasthan. And Rajasthan is in the northern part of India. And so we went there as a team. And then on Sunday, we were supposed to go to different churches. And I was so disappointed when I was assigned to go to a small church. I wanted to go to a big church. You know why? Because in the big church, that's where action is. Correct? Wow, big crowd, loud singing, and a small church. So I was discouraged. Never mind. And then when I went to the church on Sunday, I was more discouraged. You know why? I expected 30 people, but there were only 10 people. And not only that, I grew most discouraged when I was told that the church was in the existence for 20 years, and they only have 5 people, plus 5, 10. So I was very, very down. And then the pastor, I cannot remember whether the pastor or somebody else led in worship. Very simple. Right now, we're going to worship God. Let me pray. And with that guitar, he led in worship. You know what? It was a moment in time, Kodak moment that I will never forget. The moment the worship starts, tears began to roll down from my eyes. I tried to control because it's very embarrassing. And I was not the only one. The rest, weeping. And I was just the tears. Had to make it graphic, like the waterfall in Niagara. The tears just flow. Really, I couldn't control. You know why? Because at that worship service, I experienced the manifest presence of God. When you experience the manifest presence of God, you will not say, wow, who am I? But woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips. When you are in the presence of a holy God, you find that you are different. And worship leaders, you have an opportunity. Each time you lead in worship, let your words be few means what? Say what you want to say, like this morning, and then lead us in worship. By the way, it is theologically incorrect to pray, Lord, let your presence come. Have you heard of that? To say, Lord, let your presence come. And why is it theologically wrong? Because God is always present. So, to pray for God's presence to come is theologically wrong. Instead, what must you pray? Lord, let your manifest presence come. In other words, God, we recognize you are present, but we want to experience you. And that's why we call manifest presence. So, that's what Kohelet says. When we come to the house of the Lord, first proceed with caution. How? Number 1, avoid flippant talks. Number 1, how? Listen more than you talk because God speaks. Number 2, let your words be few because God listens to what you say. And then he goes on, as you look at the text, he goes on and say, proceed with conviction. And this is where troubles a lot of people. Kohelet says, if you make a promise to God, you must keep it. Because God is a serious God. That means he says that be cautious when you make a promise to God, because God takes it seriously. Let's be honest, as human beings, whenever we are desperate, what do? We make promises to God. And then, when it's over, what do? You know, I know. We forget. Like the story of this guy. He was on a boat. Suddenly, lightning, thunder came, and he was drowning, and he says, God, save me. I promise you, if you help me save me from drowning, I will become an evangelist for you. And guess what? As human beings, he did not do it. And God waited 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And finally, God approached him. Young man, did you not make a vow that if I were to save you, you will become evangelist? And that man looks at supposedly God and says, can't you take a joke? Now guys, God doesn't take a joke. When you make a promise, keep it. And not only that, he goes on to say, in that case, all right, if you make a promise, you must keep it. So it is better not to make a vow to God than to make. Question. What if you make a vow to God and then you felt it was a mistake? Or you felt that you could not fulfill? The bad news for you is this. Kohelet does not address the issue. In fact, Old Testament is very, very strict. When you make a vow, you must, no matter how, fulfill. So how? And this is where the New Testament comes in. When you make a vow to God, all right, and you felt that it was a mistake, New Testament says, what? Go to God, ask forgiveness, and repent. So there is a way out if you make a mistake. And after you have prayed, and if you still experience the guilt, remember, it is not from God. Because when God forgives, he forgets, and he literally forgives you. So, this is his protocol. Avoid flippant talks and avoid making empty promises to God, because God takes our vows, promises seriously. So, this raises a question. These protocols that he gives to us when we enter the house of worship, what is the reason? Is there a singular reason why we must observe protocol? And I'm so happy to tell you, Kohelet gives us that one singular reason, and that can be found in verse 2. Can we go to the text? Verse 2. No, the text beginning. Okay, can you see that? Why? Because God is in heaven. You and I are on earth. That is the singular reason why we must observe protocol. Because God is in heaven, you and I on earth. Now let me explain more. What does that mean? Number one, God is in heaven, we are on earth. The first thing, there is an unbridgeable chasm between God and us. There is a dividing line. And this chasm is so great, all right, that you can never cross that line to become God. So, unbridgeable chasm. Number two, unchangeable status. God will always be God. You will always be you. You cannot become God, no matter how hard you try. Because God has already, as human beings, all right? See the difference. God is infinite. You are finite. God in heaven is immortal. You and I are mortal. And therefore, you and I cannot become God. For the simple reason, God is spirit. God does not die. You and I, no matter how long we live, sooner or later, we will die one day. Sadly, in today's world, there are some teachings that teach people that when you become believers, you become little gods. Are you familiar? There is a heresy going around in the 70s. Today, not so popular. The moment you become a believer, all of you are called little gods. No way. No way. God is in heaven. You and I are on earth. Recently, I read a book. This is the New Age movement. It says this: when I think of God as an ocean and myself as a glass. And when I take the glass and dip in the ocean, this glass is full of God. Think about it. This is the most absurd idea I've ever heard. Anyway, if that is God, that is not much of a God. The God that you and I believe is sovereign. All right? It's the creator. And there is a difference between God and us. Third, there is that unfathomable ways and works of God. You see, at the end of it, Kohelet, by saying God is in heaven, we are on earth, he's simply saying the God that you and I believe is a mysterious God. Kohelet's problem with God is not his existence. The existence of God is a given. You do not find 5 reasons why God exists. You do not find, because it is given, it's accepted. But his problem is with the elusiveness of God, that somehow he cannot understand the ways and the works of God, like you and me. Remember what I told you? One of the reasons why Kohelet says that life is meaningless, life is pointless, because he cannot understand God. In what way? On one hand, Kohelet believes that God is at work in the world. God is at work in your lives and my lives. But on the other hand, he doesn't understand. If God is at work, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why are there so much social injustices? Why do the righteous suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people and good things happen to good things happen to bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people? Why? And guess what? At the end of it, he acknowledges, I cannot understand, because my God is a mysterious God. And therefore, he accepted God on God's term, that we can never fully comprehend God because of who he is. So the God that we worship is a mysterious God. If he is not a mysterious God, then that God is not worth believing in. Where is the greatness? Where is the grandeur? I have a sister, 2 sisters. The youngest one is Molly, who is a retired senior counsel. When she was a little girl in primary school, she was naughty and mischievous. I was the good guy, all right? I was the good guy, very good and homely. And so she attended St. Margaret's Primary School. I cannot remember, primary or secondary. So one day, she ganged up with her friends and says, let us make fun of our teacher. And so how? By asking her the most difficult question she cannot answer. And that group of 4 or 5 came up with the best question that they are very sure that the teacher cannot answer. And that is to make fun of the teacher. So next day, when the teacher began to teach the class, after that, Q&A. And my sister raised her hand. Teacher, I have a question. Can you please explain to the class? A black cow eats green grass, produces white milk. Wow! Everybody, the friends all very, very happy. Wow, we got the teacher. We humiliate the teacher. And the teacher stood there and looked at her and said, Molly, when you eat white rice, what do you produce? Wow, that really humbled them instead. There are some things we cannot understand, especially the God that you and I believe. Next slide. Okay. Do you know who is this guy? This guy you may not recognize, but you know his name. Michelangelo, one of the greatest sculptors and painters. And he is famous because he painted next the Sistine Chapel. All right? If you go to Rome, you must visit what is called the Sistine Chapel. And why is it famous? Because he took 5 years to paint. Now remember, it is not straight painting. Using a ladder, climbing and start painting the whole stories of the Old Testament. Can you imagine? He did that painstakingly for 5 years. In that set of paintings, the most famous painting, which I know you know, is this. Do you recognize? I am sure you do. This is my favorite painting. And this is the painting of God on your right-hand side, creating Adam. And remember, nobody has seen God. And so God is always depicted as an old man. Why? Wisdom. And so there you see God on one side, Adam on the other side. But tell me, what is the most important point in this painting? There are many things I can say. In fact, we have class art appreciation. What is the most important thing about this painting? Can anyone tell me? Yes. Yes, very good. Pastor Richard got it. If you observe the painting carefully, the finger of God and the finger of man do not touch. Unlike E.T. You've seen the picture E.T.? Huh? Do not touch. Why? Because Michelangelo captures the essence of the relationship between God and us. And this painting is to tell you, is to remind you, God is not man. Man is not God. If their two fingers connect, then I'm sorry to say, God is man, man is God. And so I pray that each time you look at this painting, remind yourselves, God will always be God. You will always be you. You cannot become God, because the God that we believe is majestic, infinite, holy. So, today's takeaway is in the form of a question. And the question is this: do you have a high view of God? If you do, continue to embrace, endorse, espouse a high view of God, because it is biblically correct, theologically sound. On the other hand, if you entertain the idea, a low view of God, then you need to repent, because a low view of God is biblically inaccurate and theologically not sound. The next one. On Thursday, September the 8th, the world was greeted with a sad news that Queen Elizabeth II, at the age of 96, passed away. And what was the thing that all the commentators would say about her? She was the longest reigning monarch in the British history. She reigned for 70 years, 7 decades. And her life has been personified as a devout Christian from the Anglican tradition, devoted to her family and the families, larger families of the Commonwealth, and dedicated to her duty as the queen. But more importantly, her life personifies loyalty, kindness, helpfulness, but most importantly, humility. So, let's roll back history and go and travel through time and go to the 17th century. Do you know who is this guy? He is Louis XIV, King of France. And he was the longest reigning monarch in the French monarchy. In fact, he beats Queen Elizabeth by 2 years. He reigned for 72 years and 110 days. King Louis of France was known for two things. Number one, opulence. That is lavish spending. He would spend so much on the garden, the palace, and it is said that his court was the most magnificent because he spent a lot of money. Number two, he was also known as a man of arrogance and pride. So much so, he calls himself Louis the Great. And at one time, he even made an infamous statement and said, "I am the state." And so, before he died, he gave special instructions to his advisors. When I die, I want a great and grand funeral. In 1715, King Louis XIV of France, he died. And so, to honor King Louis, what King Louis said, first of all, his coffin was placed in a cathedral, and his coffin was made of gold. And then instructions were given in the cathedral, all the lights to be dimmed, so that attention can be focused on him. And on his golden coffin was a candle burning brightly. And so the service began. There was hushed silence. And the one presiding was Bishop Massillon. So Bishop Massillon walked straight to the center of the coffin, snuffs out the flame, and says, "Only God is great. Only God is